Hello everyone, Bag here, and welcome to my Mortenax Blade Complete Guide and Teammate Tier List, where we will go through everything you would want to know about the only new 4.3 unit. Timestamps are below if you need to jump around, and with that, let's get into things. Mortenax is a 5-star HP scaling Fire and Hilda unit who, kinda does a bit of everything, being a mix of an Amper and a damage dealer. I want to first start off by actually going over his ultimate, as it's what his entire kit revolves around. This ultimate has a seemingly high, but not actually that bad, 160 energy cost, in where Mortenax consumes 20% of his max HP to enter into an enhanced state with a timer on the action bar, like Firefly, Acheron, or Robin, where after the timer's turn starts, he exits this enhanced state. For comparison, Robin's timer has a speed of 90, while Mortenax's has a speed of 70, meaning his state lasts a good deal longer. Unlike every other enhanced state with a timer, this timer does not come with any sort of action advance, meaning how much Mortenax and the team can do within this timer depends on when you activate it in respect to everyone's turns. This enhanced state does a lot of things. First off, it deploys a zone. This zone gives the entire team 50 damage percent, as well as either buffing the team's ultimate damage by another 75% if there is another Nihilda unit on the team, or if there's not another Nihilda unit on the team, then Mortenax gets a personal 75% damage percent buff. This zone also activates a bunch of passives that we'll get into in a bit. The enhanced state also gives a free 20% crit rate and 60% crit damage to Mortenax. It gives him access to his skill, which yes, he can only basic attack when he's not in the enhanced state. He gains 50% damage reduction and 50% healing bonus for himself. He gets increased aggro, equal to what normal Blade gets, and when Mortenax is killed in this enhanced state, he instead revives while exiting the enhanced state early, kinda like Finon or Maide. Let's now wrap back around and talk about his basic, which is a single target attack that full-on taunts one enemy for one turn. While in his enhanced state, this move does the exact same thing, but with double the scaling. His skill, which again is only usable in this enhanced state, is a simple AoE attack with 4 bounces, while also consuming 10% of his max HP. This move also cannot be used if he's at 1 HP, but on the bright side, it sticks to the HP scaler trend of not consuming skill points. Anyways, we're still not done with what his ultimate can do, as there's 2 other core parts to it. For one, it has a debuff tied to it, as if you remember, he is a Nihilda unit. I don't blame you if you forgot. This debuff is applied when the zone is deployed, and then while the zone is active, it applies when enemies are hit by any ally including Mortenax, or when enemies hit Mortenax specifically. This debuff is a combined 30% def shred and 50% vulnerability. Yes, Jiaoshuo's total buffing capability, not even equaling this single debuff that's not even Mortenax's entire buffing capability, is not lost on me. This debuff application also means he is an excellent Acheron ult stacker, as he combines the utility of E2 Silverwolf with Trend. The last core part of his ultimate, for now at least, is his second ultimate. When in his enhanced state, Mortenax's ultimate changes to be a very simple AoE big hit of damage without any other real gimmicks to it. Now at first, it might seem like a waste to use 160 energy for this big hit, when his ult timer also needs that 160 energy to be redeployed when it runs out. But Mortenax is actually given a baseline minimum of 120 energy, both at the start of combat and when his ult runs out. What that basically means is that you'll always be at most 40 energy away from entering his ult, in spite of his high ult cost, making his energy much more flexible. On top of then also having an 80 energy overcap, that makes his energy even easier to deal with. The final big thing to go over with Mortenax is his charge mechanic. Like normal Blade, Mortenax has a stacking mechanic that leads to a follow-up attack. He needs a total of 9 charge, and gains 1 charge only while the zone is active, when allies including Mortenax himself hit enemies, or when Mortenax is hit by enemies. So while Mortenax can hold onto his charge in and outside of his ultimate, he can only gain charge within his enhanced state. To be specific about the conditions, unlike normal Blade, Mortenax just needs to be hit to gain charge. He doesn't need to actually lose HP, which means stuff like Castris or Hyacine Light Cone don't really help him here, but he's also not bricked when used with shielders, besides needing healing to stay above 1 HP. And so with that, I do want to also make note that his HP consumption doesn't really do anything for his kit pre-E6, so it's more so a limiter to his sustain selection and sustainless capabilities, instead of being some actual resource to keep track of, like it is for other HP scalers. Anyways, this follow-up attack that he sends out when reaching 9 charge is just another use of his skill for free, except here it's also considered as a follow-up attack with an extra 25 energy attached to it, meaning a total of 55 energy before ER. This follow-up attack skill also gives him 1 charge for free, since it's, well, hitting the enemy, meaning after his first follow-up attack, his charge counter is functionally out of 8 instead of 9. And also yes, this counter can overstack, and if he's CC'd or stuck at 1 HP, then his follow-up won't be sent out, and instead he'll just keep overstacking his charge until he is able to send out his follow-up, sorta like how Jade works. Going to his minor traces, he has some free HP, 12% crit rate, and some damage percent. And here's where I would talk about his actual traces, except I've already talked talked about all of them, besides noting that Mortenax also gets a cleanse when he gets to max energy. So then the last thing to talk about is his technique, where he starts combat by taunting all enemies for 1 turn, while decreasing his damage taken by 90% for his first 2 turns. This is a pretty important technique, and I'll talk about why in a second. The leveling priority, his ultimate is the big priority, as it determines his debuff's potency alongside his second ultimate's big hit of damage. Past that, leveling everything is just for damage, which does matter a good deal, and you will even basic with him a good amount, so leveling it is like a Noxa level with it, if that means anything to you. So how do you play Mortenax? Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, as if you couldn't tell, he's a bit of an everyman that can fill a variety of roles. A generic buffer, a specialized resource funneler, a sub DPS, a sustainless amper, or even as a main carry. Luckily though, most of his roles have him struggle with a similar set of problems, mainly in that his zone is his most important trait, and so to maximize its use, you have to play around his energy correctly. The first hurdle is getting into his first ultimate in the fight. The expectation is to get a turn 1 ult after his first basic attack, but unless if you have his signature, which gives him his missing 20 energy here perfectly at the start of the fight, the only way to guarantee a turn 1 ult is to get hit. Luckily, his technique taunts all enemies to hit him on their first turn, although you might not actually use this technique since it initiates combat, in which case, have fun resetting. But either way, if he gets hit enough, then he can get into his ult by their first turns at the minimum. But in the first place, having enough enemies to hit him for enough energy isn't even something that will always be 100% reliable. So in those cases, he will have a slower ramp up, both for his buffing and charge stacking coming online. Really, like normal Blade, Mortenax's performance will be a bit reliant on the enemy. A lot of his game plan relies on his energy rotation, which is then expedited by getting hit, both for the base energy for getting hit, and for getting more procs of the 55 energy for launching his follow-up attack. He's also context dependent with the enemy, since a lot of his personal damage is in AoE, furthering his similarity to Tribi with how much his inconsistent personal damage contributes to his overall utility. The other factor that dictates his energy rotation, then, is his team, as the faster his allies attack, the more charge he gains for more follow-ups and energy. All of these factors leads to Mortenax's main gameplay conundrum, utilizing his second ultimate. With how much of his utility is tied to buffing, having any downtime can potentially make him feel a lot worse. To solve this, you would want to have enough energy to ult back to back, meaning you would have to play around his energy within his zone to line things up to have the required energy when that timer expires. But there are 2 things. For one, holding his energy to do this is technically massively inefficient, as we are basically using 160 energy to do the job of 40 energy, since exiting his ult gives him a free baseline of 120 energy that you wouldn't be taking advantage of. This could go the other way, however, in that saving his ult lets you carry his overcap into the next zone, whereas if you ult, gain overcap, and then the zone runs out, that overcap is overtaken by the free 120 energy. For 2, again, since his ultimate does not sync his turn with the timer through any sort of action advance, Mortenax's turn might come soon after the ult ends, meaning saving energy for his ultimate might not be needed if he can use a combination of the safety net, a basic attack, and 1 or 2 enemy hits to essentially chain ultimates back to back without any energy saving being needed. You also have to remember that, again, his ult timer isn't normalized with the team speed, so delaying his ult to push the timer down the action bar can be worth it to line it up better to have more ally turns within it, in exchange for him not getting resources or having his buff up for whatever is happening while he waits to ult. And for 3, I lied, there's 3 things, the timer acts like any other non-Finon counter, in that it resets on wave switch. So for MOC, you could go basically the entire fight without ever needing to reset it, if you are zero cycling. With 70 speed, the timer takes 142 action value to complete, meaning it'll last for almost the entire first cycle when coming from the first wave. For the other modes without a wave switch, this obviously doesn't matter, but generally, regardless of the context, the idea is similar to Superwolf's ult charge juggling. You should be looking ahead to see what the situation will be like when his ultimate ends. How fast would he get his ult back if you don't save? What damage windows would his zone even be down for during his downtime? If you do need to save, when should you start saving to make sure he has enough energy without wasting energy by saving too soon? Remember that he does have an 80 energy overcap, but that will fill up fast with the base 55 energy per follow-up. And for that downtime, also keep in mind that his 2-turn debuff is not dependent on his zone to exist. It's just dependent on his zone to be applied. So his zone going down doesn't instantly ruin his amp, it just gets rid of a chunk of it, while making his other, more important chunk go on its own enemy-dependent timer. This whole balancing act can then also change for the context of the fight, as there are a lot of fights in which specific windows incentivize AoE damage, meaning that's another factor for when you want to ult and for how much ulting versus saving matters. This is then also dependent on what role he's filling. As a resource funneler, ulting as much as possible is important for spamming Eagle if you're using it, and for getting as many hits as possible for his teammates. But otherwise, it's the standard procedure of his ultimate being important damage that you may or may not prioritize over his zone uptime. If you want a big TLDR, I do think saving his ult for constant zone uptime is usually the optimal play, but it's still good to to look out for opportunities to play around his ult's downtime to be more efficient with his energy if the situation called for it. Generally though, Mortenax will mostly just stand there looking pretty with generic amp and strong personal damage, and the weirdness with his zone timer will really only come up a few times every fight. So if you can navigate his zone's weirdness in those few moments, then the rest of his kit will basically play itself. A plug here to subscribe. We are really close to getting 50,000 subs, which is absolutely insane. Thank you so much. So if you want to help this channel get one step closer to that milestone, then sub. Alright, back to the vid. For gearing, Mortenax is a bit weird due to, again, how many different hats he can wear. For main sets, the first set I would recommend is the set that is made for him, giving him solid damage alongside a team-wide damage percent buff. The secondary option is everyone's favorite set, Eagle! There's a bit of a balancing act with Mortenax's gearing between his damage and his funneling, and here's the first crossroad. Eagle makes him a better resource funneler in exchange for being worse in terms of damage and amp. I would say default to the set that's made for him, but if you are an Eagle gamer, then rest assured he is a good candidate for your pieces. I'll also quickly mention Pioneer and Longevous as filler options for his damage, although it's worse than his actual set through losing the damage buff. And you can also try Guard. We'll talk about this in the team section, but TLDR, Mortenax likes to have ways to self-sufficiently stay above 1 HP so that he can use his follow-ups and skills without an actual healer. Guard is a way of doing this, but out of his available options, it's not something I would recommend wholeheartedly, frankly. Although maybe you can find a use for it in sustainless runs. For Planars, Bone Collection is the best for his damage, while on the supportive side you can go for any 5% ER set, with Von Weck being notable for giving him extra resource generation, and an earlier turn 1 ult if the team needs it to be that early. Duran and Salsodo are also good for his damage if you have better substats on them. I'd, again, overall recommend the simplest answer here with Bone Collection, but on a fight-per-fight basis, the extra ER and utility from the other supportive options will either be a giant difference maker, or it will at the very least do less than giving Mortenax more personal damage. So for all of this set stuff, the best answer is to have different sets that you can mix and match to experiment with for best results. But if you don't want to do that, which frankly I wouldn't blame you, then you could just default to whatever you have for him. For stats, to start off, you want a crit body. For the orb, it semi-depends on how much damage percent and HP he's already getting from external sources, but generally HP percent will be better simply due to how much damage percent he already gets in his base kit, although the difference between them will be a bit small, so as always just go for whatever has better substats. You will overall want speed for resource generation and to get his field up fast at the start of the fight. His turn is also just a good portion of his damage, so losing that turn for HP boots is usually not worth it. For rope, energy is as always very hard to quantify with how many extra ults it'll actually end up giving him, but my overall answer is that HP rope is the default, with ER being a workable option that can be better, again depending on what the extra energy means for him and his team. ER can also be a very important difference maker if it means getting him an easier turn 1 ult without a signature, and it also gets a bit extra when used with tutorial. For stat benchmarks, getting to at least 140.1 speed means that he can act twice within his zone if it's deployed on his turn or if he and the zone are coming from the first wave of MOC. This is really important for his damage, although as I mentioned, you could also per his turn directly after his zone runs out to funnel his next zone more quickly. That's much more of an if it lines up then go for it kind of thing though, and I would still overall recommend 140.1 speed for trying to maximize his damage. Plus it's also 7 turns and 500 action value for Anom as well. Also keep in mind that this exact threshold also gets completely thrown out if you have DDD, Eagle, or his E1. And it's pretty easy to assume that you'll have at least one on a given Mortenax team with how prevalent Chibi is. So in that case, this might all not matter. From there, the only things that matter are crit, where you want 80% crit rate since he gets an extra 20% in his enhanced state. HP percent is actually a really solid stat that you should prioritize alongside crit, especially for at least getting 5000 HP for Bone Collection, which may or may not be easy depending on your main stats and if you have Hyacinth on the team. You might also want a good amount of EHR depending on your light cone, which we'll talk about now. Hey, light cones! For Mortenax, there are 3 main paths that you can walk for what you prioritize with him: energy, amp, or personal damage. For energy, tutorial is the default backbone choice if you want to turn your brain off for what you put on him. It helps his energy rotation feel much more comfy. It can lead to a more consistent turn 1 ult if you have another ally that can apply Death Shred at the start of combat, like for example Ashveil, and with close to max energy overcap, you can ult into follow-up into ult without any hit RNG with an ER rope. Which, I mean, that can be clutch to squeeze out an extra ult at the end of the fight or something like that. Sure, why not? Now, this isn't a free win for tutorial, as in the nature of Nihility Light Cones, this comfort and utility from energy is a trade-off in exchange for raw stats. But at the very least for Acheron battering strats, I would say this is his best non-signature option. As, remember, we don't need a Light Cone to apply debuffs for her, since we already achieved that requirement with Mortenax's zone. For Amp, there are 3 main options: Pearls, the Battle Pass Light Cone, and Cypher Signature. The first 2 options have the problem of needing a lot of EHR for consistent application, which can then eat into Mortenax's crit and speed rolls. Cypher Sig has a lower EHR requirement, but for its full effect, you need 170 speed, which is actually pretty doable with the Lycon's 18% speed, but it can be annoying when combined with every other stat he wants to build for. The full effect isn't needed though, if you just want to use it as a less demanding speed-giving pearls. Otherwise, between pearls and the Battle Pass has the advantage of giving damage percent to Mortenax while also having better HP, on top of its debuff lasting longer, which can mitigate problems with its shaky application. And even with Mortenax's starting Death Shred, Pearls does not begin to really take off unless if we combine it with other sources of Death Shred, like from Ashveil. So overall, I would recommend the Battle Pass option first if you have it. For personal damage, Acheron Sig, Good Night Sleep Well, and Boundless Choreo are all pretty close together. So honestly, just use whatever you have free, with priority to Choreo if it helps fix his crit ratio. These options are most recommendable in carry Mortenax teams, but it's never a bad option, just generally worse than the other option's utility. Especially when, again, the Battle Pass option also gives a good amount of damage percent. So generally, Tutorial is my comfort and consistency recommendation, especially if you can get Death Shred for the start of the fight, while Battle Pass is the overall best for combining personal and team-wide amp, with Pearls also being great depending on the team's Death Shred. And then his damaging options are the last, but still good final picks. Like so much of what we've already talked about, how much the amp or energy or damage matter will vary from what's needed more from fight to fight. So he doesn't have a definitive absolute number one best option outside of Cypher Sig if you have it and have him at 170 speed. Oh yeah, his signature. It gives him HP, 20 fixed energy on his turn per wave, and an effective 30% crit damage to the team and 60% crit damage to himself. I see this signature as similar to Tribby's, it not being bad at all in isolation, but it's a lot less worth it compared to what you might expect, just due to how viable his alternatives are. Tutorial unironically gives more energy per wave, with his signature's only advantage here being the stunning energy for his turn 1 ult. And 30% crit damage is rather underwhelming total team-wide amp for a signature in general, especially when compared to, say, using Cypher's signature in an Ashveil team. This signature's best use case is for when he is used as a main carry, combining the utility of multiple light cones while also being the best by far for his own personal damage. So if you only ever plan on using him as a main carry, which by itself I normally wouldn't recommend, then it's entirely worth going for. But otherwise, it's still good for his damage and amp, but I would personally say to pass on it unless if you like him. And if you have Cypher Sig for him, then you definitely do not need it when supporting. For teams, welcome to Mortenax's teammate tier list. I'm gonna go pretty fast here as we have a lot of ground to cover. First things first, Mortenax is an incredible filler unit for any team that can slot a filler unit in. That is to say, for teams with unique teammate needs, such as Finon, Superwolf, Aglaya, or the entire Break archetype, he's not as slottable since he's usually replacing a unit who can't easily be replaced. Besides, if Finon has Cyrene E2, where then Mortenax is a genuinely great pick for generic amp. The other relation carries and Dot also fit into these categories to varying degrees of severity. Generally, in terms of raw amp combined with personal damage, Mortenax is the frontrunner generic amping support, especially since that personal damage is SP neutral, with then the ability to thoroughly win instead with his ult damage percent buff in exchange for a chunk of that personal damage. He doesn't have action advances, he has some team limitations that I'll get into, and he might lack specific synergies that other ampers have in some teams. So it's not like he completely invalidates the entirety of his competition. But if a fight is just asking for raw damage, which is a pretty broad ask, then he is hard to beat, especially with higher enemy count fights. There is one caveat to all of this, however, his need for healing. Technically, Mortenax doesn't outright require healing, as in very fast runs, the timer that his health bar is on could be outpaced by just clearing fast enough. But for most realistic scenarios, that's just not going to be possible. So then, when choosing a sustain, you might take a damage loss slotting in a generic healer over someone like Dipped, especially if you don't have a healer available that gives utility to at least one out of the two of them. You can use Dipped with his signature to try and combat his HP drain with the signature's healing, but this is just a way to slow down his health bar timer instead of outright stopping it. Still, it's entirely workable, and even if Mortenax gets to 1 HP, you still get all of his amp. So I mean, it is still really bad, but at least you don't lose everything, I guess. Here's a quick separate tier list for his healers, which should be about what you'd expect. High hit count is prioritized for his mechanics, Hyacine is the best for giving him actual amp, and Ho-Ho isn't bad either, just for her raw energy gain. The real dark horse winner here is March. Yes, Preservation March, which means I can finally use her stickers. She's here because she can actually provide consistent healing with her shield because of her E6, and she can fill a follow-up attacking niche as a secondary resource funneler for Mortenax alongside Ashveil and Acheron. She can still feel very cope in having completely single target sustain without spamming her skill, but if you can make it work, then I mean go for it. Just remember that outside of carry Mortenax, you're also sustaining for the main carry, carry, so how the sustain synergizes with them also matters as much if not more. There are some other things and groups of units that I need to make note of. First off, there's the counter units, who would compete with Mortenax for aggro. That can suck, but in fights with frequent AoE hits, they can still work well together since the fight works towards both of their game plans at the same time. Also remember his requirement for another Nihildi teammate for the team-wide ult damage % buff. As for example on Saber teams, ultimate damage is really relevant for her, which can then incentivize another Nihildi unit such as maybe Welt Sustainless to properly amp for her. Speaking of Sustainless, Mortenax can distinguish himself further by being a Welt-like pseudo-sustain. But, well, Sustainless Mortenax is kinda cope for most players. For one, he doesn't give any team-wide damage reduction, and instead he just gives it to himself while increasing aggro. So in fights with a lot of AoE attacks, he doesn't really help the team live at all, compared to Will who can at least delay the enemy. And even if you spam his basic to not consume HP with his skill, you're still on that aforementioned timer by at least automatically consuming HP when follow-up attacking or entering his ultimate. Except here, you have no theoretical shielder to protect him from getting kicked out of his enhanced state. At that point, you could juggle his revive if he can get enough energy to constantly get back into his ult, but that's, again, rather difficult to rely on consistently. So while, yes, Sustainless Mortenax is extremely powerful, it'll be very difficult to actually make work outside of heavily optimized runs that end fast enough before he or the team dies. You can use him with Will to make it easier to live, fully trading his niche and gaining value from getting hit in exchange for fully making use of both of their very strong amp. Like I said a lot so far, it is a very workable idea, but all of this is more of a min-maxy idea rather than something I would generally suggest using in normal clears. Okay, onto his actual synergies. The first of the very obvious pairings is with Acheron. We've already talked on how his debuff application is literally perfect for Acheron, giving her stacks on every ally attack and whenever he is hit, while also providing massive coveted buffs for Acheron, especially with his ult damage % since Acheron fulfills his Nihildi teammate requirement by herself. Team building can still be awkward, but it's no question that Mortenax will always be the first in the pecking order, no questions asked. For a 20-second TLDR on the third team slot, Ashveil with any investment or E1 Tribby are the defaults, then Ashveil with no investment, then Cypher or E0 Tribby or Silverwolf, then Jiaosho, then Pela. Wilt can also be an incredibly strong amp option at E4, but he's wishy-washy since he slows enemies Mortenax wants to be hit by. But he'll be at least solid either way, especially if you use him in the double pseudo-sustainless team. And obviously at E2 Acheron, all of the non-Nihildi options do that much better, but even at E0 they are already the top contenders. Okay, so he's Jiaosho times 10 in every aspect, but that was already a given. The main question here is, how much of a buff is he for Acheron? Is this a Firefly Dahlia, or is it a Feixiao Ashveil? Well, I would say it's much more of a Firefly situation. Maybe not to the exact same degree, but it is now much more easy to get high-end clears if she has the right investment. This is more so Mortenax being good for her, instead of Acheron making up his meta relevancy, as Acheron is not his strongest showing. Instead, we have to go more into Ashveil. Mortenax is the next very impactful piece in Ashveil's follow-up attack core, where they both synergistically buff each other while funneling each other's mechanics. It is a bit awkward of a synergy with Mortenax's AoE focus, but I think the idea is that Mortenax weakens enemies for Ashveil to then clean up with his ultimate, which then works with Ashveil's kit wanting those enemies to pick off. But beyond that surface level, their Death Shred stacks very nicely together. Mortenax's free skill counting as a follow-up means it's fully buffed by Ashveil's third trace. Mortenax's attacks all being AoE means he shares Tribby strength in never missing Ashveil's bait target, and while Mortenax isn't the most frequent attacker at base compared to a lot of his competition here, putting him in a frequently attacking team helps him both with his follow-up and ultimate frequency. It really is just as simple as two damage dealers that buff each other that then also support each other. Right now, Tribby, especially E1 Tribby, is the best last support here by far, but I would hesitate on pulling her for this team in case if it gets more filled out by future supports that could replace her. If you don't have her though, then the alternatives are a bit sparse, since in a lot of cases we're either losing Mortenax's personal damage %, or we are using a mostly or entirely single target buffer, or we're using a support that at least partially buffs attack, or a combination of those problems. RMC would be the best option if you can successfully juggle their buff between the two carries, and I'll note here that the joint attack gives 2 charge to Mortenax, which is kinda cool. Otherwise, any generic support option can work, and for a given account, I would just give priority to anyone with notable investment. Another very notable option is Topaz, as her 50% follow-up attack vulnerability is actually pretty good here, if not pretty oversaturated. And hey, her E1 and S1 are also free, so don't pull for them just for this, but if you have them, then she will actually pull her own weight in low enemy fights, where she can make proper use of Proof of Death. As always, Mose also exists for low enemy count fights for his raw hit count, although I wouldn't expect him to be too prevalent of an option here outside of low cost runs. Overall, Tribby is harder than usual to replace here, just due to how synergistic her amp and hit frequency are for these two. In fact, yeah, you know what, it's my video, I'll put Tribby in the top tier. They just work really well together with their AoE attacks, and Tribby's tangible personal damage does also work well when she's supporting damage dealers that can also amp. This trippy team slot can also be filled by Feixiao, in her new best team that harkens back to the old triple follow-up days. Like with pre-Mortenax Ashveil, this is her new best team to perform in, but that doesn't make her worth slotting over a strong buffer for Mortenax and Ashveil. In fact, you can really put any carry alongside these two, and it'll work out well enough. After all, their synergy together is part of what makes using the both of them for Acheron work so well. It's just sad for Acheron that you would rather replace her with a buffer like Tribi, especially if she's at E1. The last team to mention is actually Mono Rem, where Mortenax can finally find a use for his HP drains in funneling Castrus and proccing Ika's healing. And while his damage reduction means he gets less Castrus charge when hit from the enemy, his innate healing bonus means that he gets more from Ika, so it works out in the end. It's not exactly hard to see how Mortenax can work well in an HP scaling team of damage dealers, but this team is also pretty tight in who can and can't be replaced. The basic gist is, at no investment, Mortenax does a pretty good job as a side grade to Cyrene, as you replace her useful, very specialized utility in exchange for just pure raw amp. But with Cyrene investment into her E2, the gap between them becomes enormous. Whether or not this is worth pulling for is up to you, but it is a strong use case for him nonetheless. And if you're wondering, you wouldn't really want Mortenax to replace Evernight, since then you have no one generating SP for highest the spammer's skill. Finally, for Mortenax as a carry, what you're essentially doing is taking Ashveil's slot in his best team and replacing it with an Amper, which isn't that good of a trade-off since Ashveil already did a lot of amping beforehand. So doing this is worse than his full follow-up team, but depending on the enemy count, it can be very strong in its own right. For his core, I would say the standard is any two of RMC, Sunday, and Tribi, while Sparkle can be a solid replacement to anyone here, if you want to run a hyperspeed setup with Mortenax on HP boots. Jade can also be fun in pure fiction, but I wouldn't expect her to be optimal over these other heavy hitters. The sustain is hopefully Hyacine, but as we talked about before, any other healer works, with Flinkshot and Ho-Ho as the only other consistent options with direct notable utility. Alright, this team section has gone on for way too long, and there's a bit too much to summarize, but in all, he's a very versatile unit with very prominent best in slot positions, so finding a use for him shouldn't be too hard on your account, if that wasn't obvious already. Lastly, we have his Eidolons. His E1 gives the team 20% res pen within his zone, while also delaying his zone's timer by 15% or around 21 action value whenever he launches his charge follow-up. 20% res pen is the most bog standard support E1, which is to say it's great if not a bit boring. The zone delay will vary heavily in actual impact depending on what context Mortenax is in, but in having the ability to either squeeze in extra ults before having to care about saving energy, or in having the ability to not care about the zone timer by pushing it outside of the fight's used action value, in either context it'll be a very nice piece of utility. As I alluded to earlier, I do think E1 is just better than S1, unless if you are only ever playing him as a main DPS, as otherwise his Lycon options are just too competitive for his sub-DPS amping role. But I do also think Mortenax is a unit who feels very complete at E0 S0. The E1 is mostly just raw amp, which is never bad, don't get me wrong, but he's still amazing without it. His E2 makes all allies' ultimates count as follow-ups, while then also increasing the team's follow-up damage by 75%. It then also lowers his charge requirement by 2, making it functionally out of 6 after his first follow-up instead of out of 8. This Eidolon is just a big boost to everything Mortenax does well. His buffing gets another stat to add to the pile, which means more for the team and himself. Faster follow-ups also means more damage, and more funneling for his teammates, and more impactful funneling from his teammates, as every attack from the team does slightly more to get him to his next follow-up. Overall, I think this E2 is really strong, although I will reiterate that there's no utility here that is hard to play without. He just does everything in his own kit slightly better. If it wasn't obvious, E2S0 is generally better than E1S1, although E1S1 is not bad at all by itself if you want to be more safe with your pulls. His E4 gives his zone another 50 damage percent. Sure, fucking why not? Damage percent at this point is a bit saturated, but for E4 standards, this is at least better than average, although certainly not worth going for as an actual next step for a team's investment. Finally, his E6 gives him the original Blade's charge gain on HP loss, giving him back his Hyacine Sig and Caster synergy, alongside it also being procced on his own HP drains, with his proccing once per any target's turn. The damage from his second ultimate's multiplier also increases to 150% of the original multiplier. It is a pretty good damage jump, paired with some potential for uber charge gain through getting 2 charge per hit if he takes damage. It's all good, but I just don't think it's strong enough to justify coming all the way from E2 to here. If you want to go for it because you like him, then yeah, it's really good, especially if you're playing him in teams where his DPS shines. But it's not worth the 4-cost journey when E2 is such a good natural stopping point. And that's everything. Going to the channel member corner, we have Alexinator, Away Polecat, and Alvin Maker as our next new channel members. And we also have Quelver2444 and Cloney as our next new 6-month members. Thank you all again so much for your support, and with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!